Will the U.S. see the return of Donald Trump to the White House, or will the country usher in its first female leadership under Kamala Harris? Against the backdrop of this big question, on Press Perspective today, we touch upon the implications of the next U.S. administration on security here in Asia. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome. It's Tuesday, November 5th here in South Korea, and I'm Sunhee. The U.S. election is taking place today, and as the world awaits the result of this latest presidential race, we delve into the diplomatic impact of the new U.S. administration on regional security. For this, I have Thomas Maresca from American news agency UPI. Thomas, as always, it's great to have you here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I also have Yang Chien-Hao, a freelance journalist from Taiwan. Chien-Hao, welcome back.
Hello, glad to be here too.
Right, Thomas, let's begin off then with some of the latest facts about early voting in the U.S.
Right. Early voting has been strong. The turnout, I think the last number I saw was around 82 million early ballots have been cast, which would be more than half of the total votes. In 2020, there was around 155 million total votes. So strong turnout among early voting, not as high as 2020 because that was it was in the midst of the COVID pandemic, so there was a much higher than usual mail-in voting and ballot drop box type of voting. But beyond that, it's hard to really extract, conclusions about what this means. Partly because it's much higher than normally, pre-COVID, but the COVID pandemic changed a lot of early voting rules, so it's higher, but there's no real baseline to kind of measure what this means against. Generally in the past, I think turnout and early voting turnout has been a positive sign for Democrats, but this year, in some states especially, there's a much higher than usual Republican turnout, so that could be a strong sign for Republicans. I think some of the real key areas that analysts and poll watchers and the campaigns are looking at are sort of some of the crucial voter groups and how they're breaking out, from age, gender, ethnic, and just other demographics. But particularly, I think gender is really becoming one of the big stories of this election. And so far in the early voting, women have been outpacing men by something like 10 percentage points. It's something like 54 to 44 in the overall early voting, which it will remain to be seen if men can make up that gap, but that would also be a strong sign for the Democrats and Harris in this case, because women, this election has also grown strongly gender divided. Women are much more strongly supporting Harris, and men are much more strongly supporting Trump. So that's one sign that people are looking at, but it's still, at this point, generally speaking, all the polls have it as kind of a toss-up. It's really hard to draw any conclusions.
And speaking about the polls, Thomas, one of the latest ones apparently shows Kamala Harris leading in the state of Iowa, and quite a number of American media outlets have been covering this finding. Why is this reality so relevant?
Yeah, this was sort of the bombshell of this last weekend before the election. It dropped on Saturday night from the Des Moines Register, and it had Harris up 47 to 44 for Trump in Iowa, which is a strongly Republican state. Trump won in 2020 by something like 7 points, and also in 2016 by something like 7 or 8 points, and was winning in prior polling up until this point. But the reason that this has gotten so much attention is that the pollster is a woman named Ann Seltzer, who's considered really one of the best and most accurate pollsters, and she's been really on the money in the previous elections and some other midterm elections. So her poll is definitely an outlier, but she has so much credibility that people are paying a lot of attention to it. And Iowa itself is not the biggest state and wouldn't necessarily have that much of an impact on the election, but if that trend were to hold, that would spell sort of disaster for Trump in neighboring states probably, and sort of key upper Midwest swing states like Wisconsin and Michigan. There would be some sense that the same trends would continue over there. And really what Seltzer, and this highlights as well what I was mentioning about the gender issue, is that what Seltzer was highlighting and finding these numbers is that there's just a really strong late break towards Harris from women, especially older women over 65 and independents that hadn't, were not registered Democrat or Republican. And they've gone so strongly towards Harris. And one of the key issues in this campaign, and this may turn out to be perhaps the most salient issue, is something that happened between 2020 and 2024 was the Supreme Court overturned the Roe v. Wade decision, which allowed the constitutional right for abortion. And that's become a tremendous issue, and a lot of states are implementing their own abortion restrictions, and Iowa is one of them that's implemented a really strict ban and restriction. And so women have come out in response to this. It's not even just about sort of abortion per se, but even reproductive health rights. There have been some very high-profile stories recently. ProPublica just did one of women dying because they were not able to get timely treatment, having a miscarriage because the laws have been so restrictive about what doctors can do. So this has been a very salient issue all the way along. So if this poll holds true or kind of spells the trend, that would make perhaps this the key issue in this election that will decide this election. But we'll still see.
We'll have to wait and see, though. Chien-Hao, in the meantime, what can you share with us about the coverage of the U.S. election in Taiwan? I mean, what aspects of the presidential election in the U.S. is making headlines in Taiwan?
So the core issue will be how much will the new U.S. government support Taiwan, and how will the new president, how hard or how tough will the new president deal with China? When Trump was first being elected in 2016, many people in Taiwan were worried indeed. He's just like crazy guy, so he's unpredictable. Will he hurt Taiwan? That's all we concerned. I remember several days after the election, I've met a brand and strategist from the President Tsai Ing-wen, who has just left the office 6 months ago. I met one of her team charging and researching the diplomacy, and I still remember what he told me. He said that, "Don't worry, Chien-Hao, we need to calm down." Surprisingly, you will know that there will be many pro-Taiwan politicians or staffs joining Trump's team, and it will be a very good chance for Taiwan. And later, it proved to be true. We could see President Trump, later he had phone talk with President Tsai Ing-wen, and he directly sent his message, strong message, negative attitude, and criticized on China for several times. We can see also he launched the trade war, taxing and tariffing the merchandise importing from China, and approving the bill allowing the mutual visits for the United States officials and Taiwanese officials. And also the United States government has sold more weapons to Taiwan, which is more than the total amount of the 16 years from President Bush to President Obama's term. Indeed, if you look at the total, the trade volume between the United States and China, it grew more during Trump's term, which means that indeed, actually, China and the United States, each other, they're relying more. But for Taiwanese, what many people want to see is a president who can take strong stance, tough attitude toward the Beijing authority. Even just several words is enough. And Trump did it, and he did more than that. So that's why 4 years ago, when Trump was seeking for the second term, you can see Taiwan is nearly the only country in the world which, like, over 50% of the people, they are supporting Trump and hope that Trump can win again. He failed to do so, but fortunately, President Biden continued the stance of the anti-China and has promised to send troops to protect Taiwan if China really invades. And we can imagine that if Kamala Harris succeed Biden, the stand of anti-China might be maintained, possibly, and the United States will seek strengthen to the multilateral cooperation in defense against China. But if it's for Trump, we think that it will be a little bit different this time, because those so-called pro-Taiwan staffs, those members in his team, they all left. Like for example, the former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and the National Security Advisor John Bolton. They were all support Taiwan so much, but they all left. They have arguments with President Trump, and they already left the team. So Trump, you can see he's very unpredictable, and we believe that he will still be tough this time toward China, but since his people are all gone, and this time based on his keynote of American First policy, seeking unilateralism and also protectionism, he will also very likely want to get more things from Taiwan this time, meanwhile bargaining with Beijing. That will make the current Lai Ching-te government in Taipei very difficult to deal with.
Right. Keeping in mind what Chien-Hao has just said then, Thomas, and of course keeping in mind the situation here on the Korean Peninsula as well, if I were to ask you, if Asia could vote, which candidate do you suppose would be the preferred nominee?
Well, I think, if you're talking about the citizens themselves, my impression would be Harris over Trump. I don't know how well people know Harris in the region, but I think Trump has generally not that favorable of a popularity rating in most countries from what I've seen of Pew Research and other polls. And I think some of Trump's popularity doesn't really translate outside of America. He's very specific with his appeal, his sort of grievances, his specific culture issues that don't make maybe a lot of sense to people watching from afar who just sort of see this unpredictable, chaotic character. I think if you're asking who do the governments want to see win, also country by country, if you want to look at Northeast Asia specifically, I would say, no one would say it aloud, but I'm pretty sure that South Korea and Japan would certainly prefer a Harris presidency, mainly, to maintain, I think the idea was she would certainly maintain the policies of the Biden administration, which has seen a strengthening trilateral security alliance. Certainly, U.S. and South Korea have really ramped up their military partnership. And I think, for the Yoon administration, he has changed, he has directed South Korea's foreign policy sort of in this sense of becoming a bigger part of the liberal democratic world order and having a kind of a values-based diplomacy. And, this fits in more with that framework. And whereas Trump has, always been much more transactional about his foreign policies and has specifically often criticized South Korea for not paying enough for, maintaining the U.S. troops here. He said recently, he called South Korea a money machine and said he'd be getting $10 billion a year from them, whereas it's, currently it's around 1.1 billion per year for the cost-sharing agreement. I think Japan is relatively in a similar situation as far as wanting to maintain this alliance and this relationship with the U.S. I think an interesting question is, what does China want? We've heard what Chien-Hao thinks Taiwan is interested in. And I think there's two sides from China. On the one hand, you could see, yes, Trump has started the tariff trade war with them, and he has said in some interviews, he would instantly apply like 60% tariffs to China, which would obviously probably not be great for them, but also at the same time, a lot of his policies could be seen as beneficial for China's bigger geopolitical picture, especially if he weakens alliances, not just in Northeast Asia, but around the world. That gives China a lot more room to operate. And, Trump may roll back some policies that the Biden administration has implemented, like the CHIPS and Science Act, which is bringing semiconductor manufacturing back to the U.S., and just the sort of chaos and unpredictability. I think most liberal democratic countries don't want to see that come, but there's a transactional kind of opportunity for one-on-one relationships. Trump has said how much he admires Xi. Similarly with Kim Jong-un, I would say North Korea probably would also prefer to see Trump, where there's a sense of we can make deals outside of this whole framework of the international order. So it's more like a high-risk, high-reward situation when you look at China.
And staying with some of the remarks made by Mr. Trump, Chien-Hao, Mr. Trump claims that Taiwan stalled America's chip industry. What does he mean?
That was during the interview with the Bloomberg Business Week. Like Trump, he mentioned that Taiwan did take 100% of the U.S. chip business, and Taiwan should pay U.S. for defense. It's no different than an insurance company, because Taiwan did not give United States anything. Indeed, Taiwan is producing over 90% of the high-level, very advanced microchips for the world, especially on foundry. For example, for those big companies such as Apple, they have their own chip designs, but they don't own their factories. That means that they are not able to have mass productions because that costs too much. And from the end of 1980s, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, as you know, the TSMC, partly supported by the government in the beginning, instead of having its own brand, its own design, TSMC has focused on building up the factories, raising its ability to the original designing manufacturing, so-called the ODM. That means that the customers, they send the designs to TSMC, and TSMC, they produce the chips according to the design and then send back to the customers. And till now, the TSMC holds like 62% of the foundry market share around the world, which touches the most. But it's not Taiwan stealing it, I need to say. It's because that the American companies, they are not affordable to manufacture the chips for themselves, because building up the factories, they will need tons of waters and electricities, and they need to hire very high professional staffs, managing it and maintain the security. That just costs way too much. And Taiwan is able to do that because TSMC have invested and have its own techniques manufacturing. It's something to do with professional services and specialization, and making it cost less when manufacturing, so it will bring more profits to the customers. That I'm not trying to emphasize how great TSMC is, and I'm not trying to emphasize how fantastic Taiwan is. No, we are just a very small country. We need help, and we need more support from the other countries, and we do want to have cooperation with around the world. But what I want to mention is, without TSMC, those American companies like Apple, they wouldn't be able to grow. So what Trump said is totally not based on the truth, and it's very nonsense, it's very problematic, and it's very populism.
Chien-Hao, as our Thomas mentioned earlier, it's not just South Korea that Mr. Trump wants to pay more for U.S. protection, if you will. Trump has also asserted that Taiwan must pay more for U.S. protection. How much has he asked for?
If he's talking about the money, I'm not able to predict. But as I've mentioned, that during Trump's term, serving as the president, the United States have already sold tons of weapons to Taiwan, charging like $18 billion, which was more than the total sum of President Bush and Obama's term. And during the 4 years of Biden's administration, it has been maintaining into the level of $5 billion. Trump is a businessman. I think he cares more about the quid pro quo, or we can say the reciprocate, instead of the United States being asked to do this or to do that for free. I think, based on my opinion, for Taiwan, in some extent, that does make sense. Before asking others to help us, I think Taiwanese need to show our strong will, or so-called volition, against China, and try to let everybody know that we really take this very seriously, to let the United States know that it will be valuable protecting us, defending not only our democracy and also maintaining the global supply chain and the geopolitical balance. And based on that, raising the vigilance and the ability of self-defense of Taiwan itself will be definitely important. If we are not able to show that, then the United States will think that, oh, Taiwan is not active, and it will cost too much, and the result might not be good either. Then it will make the United States take less effort on it. That's what we need to learn from the past case of U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. God helps those who help themselves.
Right. Thomas, quite a number of pundits have taken issue with Mr. Trump's tendency to make U.S. allies feel vulnerable. He's also asked NATO members to boost their defense spending, or he would, and I quote, let Russia do whatever it wants to do to them. How does this tendency to make his U.S. partners feel vulnerable look to affect the sense of unity against geopolitical challenges like the war in Ukraine, as well as that in the Middle East?
I think there's a lot of concern. When you look at NATO, there's been tons of discussions about sort of this so-called Trump-proofing, NATO and NATO's aid to Ukraine. And, I mean, and the caveat, I guess, is that there's always this sense of unpredictability about what Trump might do, and he is so transactional, and if there's a way he sees something that could benefit him, maybe he would find a reason to support Ukraine more. But I think from all the signals that we've seen and his basic proclivity towards supporting Putin and speaking highly of Putin, he's given a lot of messages that he sort of blamed Zelensky for starting the war, and he's called Zelensky a salesman, and he said he would stop the war within 24 hours, which basically would mean capitulating to a lot of Russian demands and maybe freezing where the battle lines are. His running mate, vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance has outlined something similar to that strategy already, just stopping the battle lines where they are, which would leave Russia with a huge chunk of Ukraine that it currently occupies. So NATO is trying to put some, a lot of the countries have ramped up their own defense spending, and they're trying to coordinate more closely together with some of their abilities to requisition weapons and provide to Ukraine. But I think, depending on how much U.S. pulls back, there's no way that Ukraine could sustain this war. And I mean, that spills around the world. We've seen Russia and North Korea's alliance grow strongly. So if you have a strengthened Russia who can regroup, it's kind of foolish to think, oh, they'll just stop and everything will go back to normal, once they regain their strength, especially if the U.S. is not showing, a strong position against them and is weakening alliances. I mean, China will take a message from that as well. And, so I think the concern extends around the globe. Again, there's some sense maybe you can make a deal with Trump somehow on the sideline. I know Zelensky and some Ukrainians have tried to say, oh, there's, Ukraine has a lot of mineral resources that are quite valuable. So, I guess there's always that hope. But by most of the signs we've seen, I think a lot of the world is trying to prepare for a Trump, if Trump were to win, to kind of future-proof. I mean, South Korea has done it too. They signed a 5-year cost-sharing agreement with the U.S. in October before Trump took power to try and keep him from, radically raising the demand for the prices. But there's also the sense Trump could just try to rip that up and start over again. So I think, no small bit of concern about the future of alliances and the sort of global order.
Right. And Chien-Hao, very briefly speaking, because I believe we have like about 40 seconds left, what are your thoughts with regard to the possibility of an armed confrontation within the Taiwan Strait?
Many experts are now predicting that it might happen around like 2027, because it will be the 100th anniversary of the People's Liberation Army's establishment, the PLA. So many people think that, and also it will be another 4-year term of President Xi Jinping. Yeah, so he might need to achieve something. So it will have, that's very possible for like China to invade Taiwan. But the problem is, if China is really able to handle that, if the sacrifice or the damage is too harsh, too severe, and it's not worthy, right? Think about it. If like the semiconductor, those factories is being destroyed, that will also affect not only Taiwan but also China and the world's economy. Like it's estimated that it will drop from like 10 or 15% of the GDP. That will cause it's just like a disaster. It will be like irreversible. Yeah. So the problem is like we need to raise up the sacrifice or the cost for China to invade Taiwan.
Right, to make sure that does not happen in the future, of course. All right, Chien-Hao, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your insights today. And Thomas, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for Press Perspective today. Do join us again, same time tomorrow.